Hey guys, Watch Mojo here with another top 10 list, this time bringing you the 10 best combat types in Marvel Future Fight as of February 2023. Now, before we get into it, no list would be complete without honorable mentions. And although this list looks very different from last year's list, or the 2021's list, we do have Agent Venom as an honorable mention for his insane passive and leadership and artifact effects for symbiote allies, as well as his PvP value. Very good character, just did not have quite enough to make it onto the list, so he had to be left out. As far as the rest of the list, without spoiling too much, 60% of last time's list is not in this year's list. That is a massive overhaul for the combat class, and what that essentially means is we've seen a lot of reworks for combat types, and we also know through just enjoying the game, we've seen a lot of tier 4 combat types. So many, in fact, that even I have skipped one of them. Coming in at number 10, we have Sif, and this one should be very familiar to you if you have gotten this Asgard Invasion uniform from back in 2021. This is a crazy good uniform for all of the effects that it gives Sif to enable her to be an amazing leadership and support for virtually any team, but specifically good for combat teams. Combat types are going to be able to reap that full advantage of the leadership to the tune of 30% HP and 35% physical attack, and then her uniform effect, which is really what brings everything together, gives all allies, regardless of their typing, regardless of their allegiance, whether they're villains or heroes, 10% all speed, which is attack speed and movement speed, and then 45% increased damage dealt to boss types. Boss types would be any sort of PvE boss that you encounter in things like Shadowland, World Boss Ultimate, World Boss Legend, and GBR, as well as other things like I believe ABX and ABL. So very strong passive effect for Sif here. But what makes her good as well is she's in a very rare class of characters, as you will see from the rest of this list, as a combat female hero. We don't get too many of them, and Sif actually still holds up pretty well despite being an older uniform. Speaking of combat females, at number 9 we have Titania, and if it weren't for all the tier 4 males, Titania would be much higher up on this list for her insane burst damage potential and her very easy rotation. Really flashy skills, lots of cool effects like silence and burn, explosions out the wazoo, burning ground, V-pad. I mean, she's got a V-pad skill where she spins around like a barbarian. You've absolutely got to love it for Titania. A bit harder to play than some other characters because you need to take damage in order to scale her damage, but she does offer a ton of damage in return if you can make it work. She surprised me with how good she was for GBR when we tested her versus Dormammu, and she is still extremely meta for the Combat Female Day of ABX. We have had replacements for the Combat Villain Day, which she was previously meta for, but of course those pesky tier 4s get in the way. But on top of all of that, she's one of the prettiest looking combat types in the game, and as a fan of Wolverine, that's kind of saying a lot. Keeping up with the theme of muscle mommies, at number 8 we have She-Hulk, and when she's not reading lawyer texts to put you in jail, she's putting the clamps on you with her thighs. She-Hulk got a massive rework for her Disney Plus show, and while that may be a divisive topic, how good She-Hulk is in this game is not a divisive topic at all. She's a very good leadership, easily one of the best leaderships in the game, but that's not where she stops. She has an artifact passive that also buffs all gamma radiation Hulk type characters, which is a great sort of forgotten support. And then on top of that, she's a good damage dealer. She is meta at this point in time for ABX, in that same category for combat female as Titania, on top of the fact that I think she's a bit of an underrated damage dealer herself for content. She can put in work with the best of them. She's proc friendly, which is really great. If you don't want to build her for something like ABX, you can build her with a proc rotation in mind. And she's got some pretty dope skills with a lot of green gamma. We've got a little cameo by Hulk himself, and then of course the classic pointing and reading, sort of like Phoenix Wright-esque lawyering. Taking us back to Support City at number 7 is Valkyrie, and Valkyrie also represents the last of the tier 3/transcendeds on this list. That's right, The rest of the list from 6 down to 1 or up to 1, they're all tier 4s. So you really have to appreciate how strong Valkyrie is, that she's going toe to toe with these characters in a top 10 ranking. And for Valkyrie, it's really a combination of some of the things we said about Sif, in addition to having higher damage and a more consistent rotation and a proc friendly rotation, which makes her very flexible for a lot of content. Still, you have to acknowledge that she is outclassed DPS wise by virtually any tier 4, even at level 80, but most of these characters would not be able to do what they do at the level that they do it at if it were not for Shield Maiden of Asgard. This is one of the best passives in the game, period. So strong. 35% ignore dodge, 55% increased damage to villains, and 25% decreased damage received. This is so good, it even has PvP value with all of those insane villains like Jean, Carnage, and Hulk running around wreaking havoc on Timeline Battle. Oh wait, but I forgot, she already has that on the artifact. That's right. If that wasn't enough for you, you were thinking maybe she needs a lead like Sif. No, buddy. She has the artifact passive. All allies increase basic damage dealt to boss type. So technically, she does have Sif's other uniform effect rolled into hers. Kicking off the list of tier 4s, we start first with Moon Knight at number 6. And I think from here, we're going to see a bit of disagreement in the community, which I do welcome in terms of ranking the tier 4s. But from here on out, they are all tier 4, so they do have that in common. And in general, what I'll say is I don't want to repeat it for the rest of the characters, so I'll just start with Moon Knight because we're all familiar with his gameplay. It hasn't changed too much in the past few years. Is that there has to be, at least for this list, a balance between PvE and PvP. So if we take a look at all of the remaining tier 4 combat types, you find that Moon Knight has the least PvP value. So that is why he finds himself at number 6. But don't let that fool you. Number 6 is not a bad place to be when everyone else on the list is a tier 4 because of how many combat types we have in that category. And what Moon Knight lacks in PvP value, he more than makes up for in PvE value. He has insanely high burst damage. He has insane flexibility with builds as well. Basically, the only thing he can't make work is a CTP of Judgment. And he has one of the only tier 4 ability that provides a continuous heal, which is super duper cool. Very thematic. It puts a moon on the ground. It looks dope. And it also buffs his damage. Really, the only negatives and the only other criticism I could make of Moon Knight besides the lack of PvP value, but it kind of goes hand in hand, is his fragility. And fragility in the sense of having lower than average defenses and having less than ideal damage reduction, which is usually a staple of the combat class. Keeping in mind what I said about Moon Knight for number 6, at number 5, we have Venom. And for Venom, it's more of a balance of PvE and PvP, a balance of offense and defense, rather than an all-out assault on one. So the main difference that I would say is, as you'll be easily comparing these characters in terms of, number 5, number 4, number 3, for Venom versus Moon Knight, because they're so closely ranked and they're so closely placed, is the difference being the offense versus defense. Where Moon Knight is going to beat Venom in offense, Venom is going to beat Moon Knight in defense. And that actually rings out to the tune of Venom actually having, believe it or not, some PvP value. And if you don't believe me, go check out Commander's video. But it really boils down to his passives, right? His passives include 45% ignore dodge, 30% damage reduction, and then as a symbiote, he can tap into all of those Agent Venom passives. And that's why we left him on that honorable mention, because when you put all those passives together, he makes the symbiotes super duper tanky with chain hit damage reduction, etc. Really making him a formidable opponent. But so you can see here, the list continues for Venom. Again, not as high damage as Moon Knight and not as high damage as some of the other characters on this list, but he makes up for that with chain hit damage, increased crit rate, but then the super armor all defense, the balance of offense and defense. He has a chunky 30% heal there that he pops off. Up next at number 4, we have the Incredible Hulk, and this one's gonna sting a little bit. He should probably be number 1 if it weren't for those pesky reworks and nerfs. But Hulk, in my opinion, is still an amazing character and possibly still kind of underrated. But it kind of goes with the territory of being the best character in the game, and then being nerfed and then no longer being the best character in the game. So I don't blame Hulk fans for being salty. I also don't blame people for kind of underrating Hulk at this point, but he is still very, very strong. He can still hold his own in PvP. He's one of the best PvP characters, despite not having a revive, which is almost it's almost a death wish at this point in PvP, but Hulk does make it work. And I think what people forget is how good he still is for PvE. Despite the rework, despite his maybe lackluster performance in GBR and ABX at this point with better options out there, Hulk still puts in a ton of work, and people forget he's doing all of this with all of you having PvP builds on him. I know for the few of you that have a rage on Hulk, you can attest to this. He still swangs and bangs with the best of them. So really, in my opinion, Hulk represents the goal of this list in the sense of being one of the most balanced characters in the game, where he can do PvP with a PvE build, and he can do a little bit of PvP with a PvE build. Kicking off the top 3, we have Captain America. And I know this one is going to confuse some people because I didn't tier 4 Captain America, but I'm saying he's the 3rd best combat type. But it really boils down to 2 things. One, combat fatigue. I think for a lot of people, they were just tired of combats by the time Captain America came out, and they just didn't really have the justification for it, considering they had already invested in Moon Knight, they'd already invested in Hulk, etc., etc. But it's hard to deny how good Captain America is, especially with his reworked tier 3 skill on this uniform. He's just so dang strong. And if you got those vibes of PvP from Venom, you're going to get them even harder for Captain America. Same skill, super armor, all defense, higher damage reduction. We know how tanky he is. He cleanses himself. His leadership gives 45% HP to all allies, which is the highest HP that any character can give on a leadership. And then his skills work so well together. Not the most proc friendly, can be a little bit frustrating to play as a proc character, but with the counterattack and the ignore iframe, with the incapacitation and the penetration, with the healing and the residual damage, he really puts in work. And one of the biggest selling points for Captain America, and also one of the things that I think hurts his conversion to tier 4, is how strong he is at tier 3 level 80. By far, in my opinion, the strongest tier 3 level 80 of any of the combat types, which in my opinion speaks to how strong he is. Look at his base stats and how thick this dude is. He really is like the beacon of what a combat type is, with insanely high base stats and just super tankiness throughout the wazoo. Top 2, and he's not 1, it's Namor coming in at number 2. And for a lot of people, I think Namor is their number 1. I think he's a very strong character, and he got one of the coolest glow ups of the year with his MCU uniform. I have been ragging a lot on MCU updates lately for their lack of depth, but Namor does put a smile on my face whenever I play with him. He's so fun. He looks so cool, so thematic. He's back to dealing water damage, not fiery water damage. And he's just still one of the most iconic characters, and they did such a good job with his skills, such a good job with the camera, such a good job with the uniform and how it reflects exactly what the character looks like in the movie. He's just super duper strong, and the craziest thing is he had a bug, right? Namor had a bug on his second skill where he was removing the buffs from enemies. They patched that, which was technically a nerf, but nobody noticed. Why didn't they notice? Because that's how strong Namor is. He's absolutely cracked, and he's basically a PvE powerhouse, combining the insane stats of Captain America with absolutely disgusting high damage for PvE content. Very little PvP value, which is where you could maybe argue that Captain America or Hulk should be higher and Namor should be a little lower. But what he lacks in PvP, he very much so makes up for in PvE. Like, look at these stats. Over 80,000 physical attack, you know, insane HP, insane defenses. He's super duper tanky, easy to play, fun to play with Talokan's spear, allowing you to just fly around the arena all the time. And just an absolute delight of a character. One of the best reworks I think we got last year, and someone that I think will continue to maintain value as a combat villain into the future. And so that leaves us with Carnage at number 1. And I know this is going to confuse some people, but I do believe Carnage is the best overall combat tier 4 in the game right now. And it pains me to say that, maybe because I know the investment for Carnage, The artifact is an absolute necessity, but if you take a look at the totality of his capabilities, right, the total production that he can provide you, and just like Hulk, the ability to do PvE with a PvP build and vice versa, it's very hard to deny his value, right? He's got counterattack, he's got ignore iframe, he's got long iframes, he's got insane healing on his tier 4 based on the damage that he deals or takes. You know, he's got everything going for him. A bit of a harder character to play in terms of having to take damage in order to scale his damage, which is super easy in PvP, but yeah, a little bit harder in PvE. But he really does put the clamps on most characters. He can go toe-to-toe with almost any PvP character because of the fact that he can be immortal for up to 7 seconds. He's basically the more current reincarnation of like a top-tier Wolverine for PvP, but he combines all of that with still insane productivity for PvE. I think people were so impressed and so taken by how good he was for PvP that they switched him over and then forgot how good he was for PvE. Go back and check out some of those clips of Carnage just absolutely ripping through content, high-level content on Ultron and Gore, just tearing through that content because of how well his damage scales once the boss starts doing enough damage to max out your accumulation in one hit. Very much so like a Sharon Rogers in that sense. Not as high with the burst damage, but just once you get to higher stages, higher levels of PvE content, the accumulation is just instantaneous. So yeah, I think Carnage takes the cake. It really comes down to that artifact. I think if it wasn't for the artifact, he would not be where he is. Like the immortality is very hard to it's very hard to crack, and it's very difficult to deal with. It's almost more difficult to deal with than a character that revives. I've said this before, but because of the fact that they're still alive and they can still do damage, they can still keep building towards their tier 3, their tier 4, and in his case, his tier 3, while it can be a little frustrating to play in PvP or PvE, I should say, his PvE, his tier 4 is very good, right? Healing based on damage dealt, and then increasing his damage as well, his basic damage, which scales better than attack. Very, very strong effects. And so yeah, you combine all that with all of the passives, all of the stuff we talked about already for symbiotes. So I think that that makes Carnage our de facto #1. But yeah, hit me up in the comments down below. Let me know what you think of the top 10 list. Thank you so much for watching Mojo, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.